Listen, Harvey now everyone sees as this sort of repulsive monster, which he was and is on one hand, but I think what is interesting and what isn't maybe brought forward is that he was also an extremely exciting, brilliant, stimulating person to be around. He was at the top of his game at that time. He held all the cards. Everybody came to him. And I'm not just talking about people in the entertainment industry, I'm talking about people in politics and in big business and industry. And so to be in the enclave of somebody that powerful, was very exciting. He was also very unpleasant to be around, but he was a master manipulator, and his moods changed very quickly, and you never knew whether you were, his confidant or whether you were going to be screamed at. So it was a very highly adrenalized environment.
When did you first notice that he had a problem with women?
I don't know that I could say I noticed he had a problem with women. I think, again, it's very difficult. Everybody now says, why did everyone go to his hotel room? It wasn't as simple as that. Everybody went to his hotel. This was where he did business. It wasn't in his bedroom, it was in his suite. You had top agents, top movie stars, male and female, coming in hourly for meetings. This was his place of business. So it wasn't sort of this spurious, weird thing that you had to go up to his room. However, he had a lot of meetings with actresses, and he clearly had girlfriends. He had regular female visitors who were actresses, sometimes aspiring actresses, well-known actresses, and they clearly had a fairly intimate personal relationship with him. But as an assistant, that's not really something that you're involved with.
Did you assume that those relationships were consensual? Did they seem just to be part of that world?
Yes, I presumed they were consensual, but there were obviously some women who were reluctant to come. When you'd ring up to try and make a meeting, they'd always come up with excuses, and Harvey would get very angry and threatening, and would threaten, you personally, that you had to make sure that this meeting happened. With Harvey, there was no such word as no, and I think that's really the crux of the matter.
Zelda, when you first started working for him, some voices were warning you what he was like.
I had one warning, and I have to say that woman really saved my honour, because actually being warned is very important, because it armed you. And all she had said to me was, always sit in an armchair, don't ever sit on a sofa next to him, and always keep your puffer jacket on. And there was no more than that. But actually it was an incredibly important and good piece of advice, because it meant that I was ready actually when he did start behaving badly. And it also meant that I wasn't as frightened, because I knew that it had happened to other people. So, I was very robust in the way that I dealt with it. And he took that. He was very persistent. And
what did he do?
Well, I think everybody by now has read pretty much everything, that he's done, and he didn't have a very original repertoire, but it was a system that worked. Massages, inappropriate suggestions, expecting people to work with him, unclothed. But, pretty much everything that you've read I've had to experience at some point or other.
And you then passed that warning on?
I did warn people that he had a habit of behaving inappropriately, but that they were safe, because I had always been safe. And I genuinely never was physically threatened by him, emotionally and psychologically, constantly, but never physically. And I said, I'm afraid he's a pain. He will behave inappropriately. You just tell him where to go. You're tough with him. Nothing will happen. But I was wrong.
And it came to a head for you when he sexually assaulted, attempted rape on your colleague.
Yes, we were at the Venice Film Festival, and he tried to rape her.
And what did you do?
She was extremely distressed. She was shaking, very distressed, clearly in shock. Didn't want anybody to know, was absolutely terrified of the consequences, what would happen. And I spoke with her and tried to calm her for about half an hour, and then I went straight downstairs to where Harvey was having a business meeting on the terrace and told him he needed to come with me right away. For me to have broken into a meeting like that was very unusual, and he did not question me. He got up and came with me straight away because he knew why I was as angry and serious as I was.
So you accused him of attempted rape,
Yeah.
essentially?
Yeah.
And he denied it?
Yes.
And then
He said nothing at all had happened. And he swore on the life of his wife and his children, which was his best get out of jail card that he used quite a lot.
And did it ever cross your mind that he might be telling the truth?
No. Not if you saw the girl that I had just seen. And at this point, 3-4 years down down the time of working for Harvey, I knew him pretty well. I knew when he was telling the truth or not.
And then what did you do?
We returned to the UK, and I spoke to my only senior in the Miramax offices, and she suggested that I got a lawyer. So we both resigned from the company, saying that we felt we were constructively dismissed because of his behaviour, and that he'd be hearing from our solicitors.
And so you found a lawyer, solicitor?
Yes, and at this point I thought we were going to go to criminal proceedings and take him to court, and that he would be punished for what he had done.
You were prepared to go that far and have him locked up?
Well, it was the only route I thought there was. I mean, it was the only route, as far as I was concerned.
And what happened?
The lawyers made it very clear that we didn't have very many options. Because we hadn't gone to the police when we were in Venice. We had no physical evidence, and ultimately it would be 2 under 25-year-olds women, words against Harvey Weinstein, Miramax Film Corporation, and essentially the Disney company. Because I naively believed that if we went to Disney, they would be horrified and would fire Harvey or help us with the proceedings. But the lawyers made it very clear that that was not how the world worked.
So you were ready to bring him down at that point. You took the only option you thought you could, and you faced doors slamming in your face, essentially.
Yeah, and it sounds odd, but for me, this was really where my trauma started and my abuse started. I could deal with Harvey. He was an unpleasant, difficult man, but I had ways of dealing with him. What I couldn't deal with, what I had no equipment for, was to deal with the legal system. Essentially I'd gone to the parents to say, somebody's done something bad, and there was no recourse, it seemed. And that was really shocking and very frightening to discover that the law couldn't help me. In hindsight, it wasn't as simple as that. My lawyers were giving me the advice they thought was best. However, And I think probably if we had gone to the police, I don't know what would have happened, in truth. I don't know if we would have got anywhere. You know, and at 23, when you're faced with that, your own advice, you know, the advice from your own legal team is be quiet. You know, you will get dragged backwards, forwards and sideways through the courts, as will your family, as will your friends, as will anybody who knows anything about you. You haven't got a chance. You will be destroyed. It's quite difficult to know where to turn.
Do you think now that you were terribly advised, or do you think they protected you as best they could?
In truth, I don't know.
You ended up signing a non-disclosure agreement. Tell us how that came about.
This was very difficult because once the lawyers presented a damages agreement as our only option, the one thing that I was very clear about was that we had to find some way of stopping Harvey's behaviour, and two, that I didn't want money to change hands at any point. At this point, I was told the only way that we would even get Miramax to the table was by making a monetary request. I mean, it was a very intense agreement in terms of the secrecy. I was not allowed to ever speak to anybody about even really my time working at Miramax. I was not allowed to speak to a therapist without them signing a confidentiality agreement. I was not allowed to speak to my accountant with regards to the money that I received.
Which was how much?
It was 125,000. And I think at this point, once I realised that this was my only arsenal, the only thing I was going to have to try and prevent Harvey's behaviour, was to create an agreement that was as binding to him and as difficult for him as it was going to be for me. And the only way that I could accept the fact that money was going to have to change hands was that he was going to have to do an awful lot for that money.
And what did you ask him to do?
Well, there were a lot of obligations initially, but during the negotiations, we had to concede some of them. But some of the main ones that stayed in was that he had to attend therapy for his behaviour, and that I was to be present in his first therapy session because I was very concerned that he wouldn't talk about the relevant reason that he was at a therapist's. Again, you have to remember this is a man who can manipulate everybody, and I was very aware of this. And I was trying to put teeth into any little clause that I could.
And did you go with him to that therapy session?
That never happened. I don't know if he attended therapy or not. I pushed to have this meeting, but his legal team kept stalling. And after this process, I actually was pretty broken. I was pretty broken and exhausted and so disillusioned. And I didn't have the energy to go on fighting. And in reality, it was not my obligation to follow up his obligation. And what's extraordinary looking back is you would imagine that Miramax Films would have been bending over backwards to make sure that all of those obligations were fulfilled. But they weren't.
Your career path was ended at that point?
Pretty much, yeah.
So what did you do?
I ended up moving to Central America to train horses. I did spend a little bit of time trying to look for work again in London, and it was a pretty unpleasant experience because my reputation was pretty suspect. And when you've spent a month of your life fighting with every ounce of your strength for the right and to stop, you know, a predator, to have to face that kind of environment afterwards was very, very hard. I really couldn't stay in the industry at that point.
He calls himself a sex addict now. Do you think that was at the root?
No, I don't think he's a sex addict. He's a power addict. Everything he did, everything that drove him was about dominance with men and women. He put an enormous amount of energy into humiliating men and an enormous amount of energy into getting women to submit and getting men to submit. That was what drove him, you know, his overarching need for power.
So you think now, if you had been listened to at that point, everything that came after 20 years ago would have been avoided?
Yeah. It was the entire system, you know, and the system essentially protected Harvey in this case, but I can guarantee you it protects 100 other people like that. Because if you have the power and the money to create agreements that cover up essentially a very serious, in this case, criminal action, then I dread to imagine, you know, what other things are being covered up.
You describe these feelings of signing an NDA that basically put you in exactly the opposite position to the one you'd hoped. You wanted to be speaking out, you wanted to be changing the culture, and you were gagged. How long did you live with that before you had enough?
Well, this happened 19 years ago. During that time, there were a couple of occasions where I made attempts to circumnavigate my agreement. However, it's almost impossible for me because one of the clauses of the agreement disallows me to have a copy of it. So I don't actually have a copy of the agreement that I signed.
Why?
Because it's a smoking gun. If you have an agreement that somebody has signed that says that he will go to therapy, that he will be dismissed from his own company if anybody else makes a claim in the ensuing period, you know, that an HR policy for sexual harassment has to be brought into the company, it's pretty clear that something's wrong.
So they never let you have a copy of it? They never let you see the whole thing?
I'm allowed to look at it supervised I was allowed to look at it supervised in my lawyer's office.
What do you think should happen with NDAs now? I mean, as you say, you broke your cover, you want others to do the same.
Listen, I'm not stupid. I understand that non-disclosure agreements have a place in society and for both sides. But it's really important that legislation is changed around how these agreements are regulated. You cannot have a legal document that protects a criminal. This isn't someone selling you a dodgy car, you know. And in fact, now the state of California, New Jersey and New York are changing legislation so that you can no longer hide sexual assault or abuse in a non-disclosure agreement. I want that to happen here. It has to happen here. We're a civilised culture. You know, this has to be debated and the law needs to be changed. You can't change the Harvey Weinsteins of the world. There are always going to be people who follow the darker side of their character. But if the rules and the laws that we have to protect ourselves enable that, then there's no point in having them.
Do you think that culture is changing now? Do you feel that this has been a proper watershed year?
I think it has. I think it's still got a very long way to go. I think that women are in a much stronger position, but I think we have to be extremely careful. And I think the media has to be very responsible with its reporting. But I think there's still a long way to go.
Do you think Hollywood will change now, or do you think it will always go where the money is and the artistic minds are?
Yes, I think Hollywood will change, but this isn't just about Hollywood. This isn't about Hollywood. This is about, the reason that this story's captured everybody's imagination is because it involves glamorous, famous people. And because if you were trying to paint a fantasy monster, Harvey fits the bill perfectly. So it's a perfect media storm. But this isn't about Hollywood. This is about the abuse of power.
How do you think you will see 2017 in this context in your life, looking back?
It's an interesting question because everybody, when they talk to me about this, say this must be very distressing for you. And the one thing it isn't is distressing. The last 20 years have been distressing, where I've not been allowed to speak, where I've not been allowed to be myself. And not just for me, for lots of women who've not been able to own their past, and for many of them, their trauma. And I think I've realised that actually it was much more traumatic than I realised at the time, because the freedom of being able to speak and being validated and being able to now see that I wasn't mad, that, you know, this was wrong, this is wrong, this is right. And that although, you know, the process that I went through was legal, it was immoral. And now I feel that maybe I can be instrumental in some sort of change. And if I can make one good thing happen out of something as horrific as all the damage that Harvey has caused, then, you know, that makes this year a fabulous year for me personally.
Zelda Perkins, thank you.
Thank you.